I'm going to give it one more minute and then we'll start. Okay, here we go.
Okay, can you hear me again?
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar for today. We're doing reserve studies and contracts this morning. I'd like to introduce one of our valued business partners and also one of our newest board members too, our CI board member, Ross Hardy from Criterium Hardy Engineers. Ross is going to get started here today. We will start the presentation in just a minute. Good morning. Ross, I'm going to hand it over to you and turn off my video here, but I'll be around if you need me.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kathy.
Absolutely.
Let me try to get my screen sharing here too. Bear with me a minute. Okay, I think we should have it here. Kathy, real quick, can you see the screen now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right. Good morning, everybody. I appreciate the opportunity to have a webinar here and discuss reserve studies and contracts. I'll give a little bit of background on myself first. We're a professional engineering firm here located in St. Louis. We provide a range of residential, commercial, and HOA services. Our services specifically tailored to homeowner associations include things like reserve studies, structural evaluations, design, project management, vendor solicitation, and transition studies, just to name a few. We're part of a national franchise based in Freeport, Maine, and we have representation throughout the United States. My brother and I both grew up here in St. Louis, so as you can imagine, we're avid Cardinals and Blues fans and proud to call St. Louis our home. A majority of our work here in St. Louis is really in the St. Louis market in the Eastern Illinois. However, we do regularly conduct services throughout the Midwest, from Oklahoma all the way up to North Dakota. A little background on us: Kyle has nearly 25 years of engineering experience. He purchased the St. Louis office here in 2014, and I previously spent about 15 years in corporate finance before joining Kyle in the St. Louis market here in 2017. So since then, it's been a pleasure servicing the St. Louis market. So today, I'm just kind of a quick agenda what we're going to try to go through. I know we have, Kathy, I believe, an hour and a half. I want to leave some time open for questions at the end. So if we do have time, I'll get to that fifth piece there. But otherwise, the first thing we're going to go through is Reserve Study 101. I know many of you probably had a chance to join the last webinar in which Andrew Stoutenberg from Reserve Advisors, he conducted a very good presentation on reserve funding challenges. So in an effort not to kind of repeat information that was just previously gone through, I won't be spending too much time in the reserve study report itself, but I'm going to focus more on the basics of what a reserve study is, the importance of reserve studies, and presenting reserve studies to a collective membership in that portion. Then we'll kind of go through, once the reserve study is complete, what's the next steps for the board members that are trying to really get their arms around it and develop a plan. Then I'll go through contracts and contractors. And then lastly, I'm going to go through a little bit, I know it's kind of the trend right now to go through some of the COVID stuff, but I am going to go through a little bit of information on COVID-19 in your building and some thoughts and things that we've kind of collected to help manage that and air quality and things like that inside of buildings. And then, as I mentioned, if we have time, I'll go through a little bit of information on a transition study. It's just to kind of give you a gist, and most people actually haven't heard of a transition study, but it's typically conducted when a association moves from the developer into the HOA ownership. And what we'll do then is conduct what's called a transition study and help look for deficiencies and define the character and the structure of the community and make sure that everything is as should be to assist the community in transitioning the ownership of the board there. So if we don't have time to go through that today, we'd love to have an opportunity to maybe go through that another time. I may post something online as well. So Kathy, I may take that study and maybe post on our website. So I'll give you the information after the call, and if we don't get to it, then it may be something that the group can go through if they'd like on their own time after this. I'll also provide a copy of, I'll also provide a copy of these slides too. We try to develop this report or this presentation a little bit so that the deck that I put together is kind of self-explanatory. So instead of just bullet points, we try to add a little more detail. So hopefully it's a good resource for people to flip through if they need to after this call. So I'll get that over to you, Kathy, too, and then you can supply that to the people that attended. So, and just like to say, I appreciate everybody's time today. I appreciate that taking time out of your busy day to go through this, and I hope that we're able to provide you some good information that's relevant and resourceful for you. And if, as I said, if you have any questions at the end, we'll go through those. And Kathy, we didn't talk about this. I would assume that maybe we'll type those in, and then you can help me kind of coordinate or go through those at the end.
Absolutely. So all the attendees, they can go down to the bottom to chat, and they can like submit questions, and we'll get to those at the end. And I'll help you funnel those too, Ross.
Perfect. Thank you. And then again, if we'll provide obviously our contact information. So if anybody has any questions after the call, feel free to reach out to us, email us, call us. We'd love to help. So as I mentioned, kind of starting on the reserve studies, I'm going to go through some of the basics of what a reserve study is. This is probably repetitive for most. So I'll go through it quickly, and then obviously you'll have it in hand after the presentation if you'd like to go back through it in more detail. But really, what are reserves funds? So each HOA typically has HOA dues. So it's what the homeowners pay on typically a monthly, sometimes annual basis to the community. Ideally, those fees that are paid by the homeowners should be basically split into two funds. You have your operating expenses, which the day-to-day operations, ongoing maintenance community. And as you see there, some examples of lawn care, utilities, general maintenance, insurance, that type of things. And then a portion of that is allocated to what we call a reserve or capital expense account. And these are all the major long-term projects. So really, it's almost like a savings account that you're putting aside the money for future major replacements like roofs, major asphalt replacement, siding replacement, those types of things. So they're non-annual. If they're under $2,000, it's typically a threshold we look at, maybe $3,000 depending on the community. If they're under that, we would just still consider that part of maintenance. But as I mentioned, some examples there are kind of listed: major mechanical systems, elevators, pools, those types of things. So I get this question a lot from communities on what is an adequate reserve allocation percentage. So how much of your dues should be going into reserves each year? And it's not a question that there's a direct answer to, but I did just kind of put together a quick graph of, I can't remember the number, but it's roughly 50 to 60 reserve studies that were done last year. Most of these are in the St. Louis market, a little bit through the Midwest, but took each of those and then tried to determine, once we looked through their financials, determine what the allocations need to be going forward. Then we said, well, what percentage of that of their operating budget is that now? And to get to a fiscally viable position, most of those fell right around the 20 to 30% ratio. So I just wanted to kind of throw out there to give an idea. I always say we recommend at least 20%. But each community, as I mentioned, each community is different. I mean, you may have a small community that has a bunch of amenities. In that case, that's when you see that maybe half of their dues need to go into reserves because maybe there's only 12 homeowners, but they have a pool and they have indoor, interior components and a clubhouse, those types of things. And then smaller communities where maybe it's single family HOAs, it's on that 5%, but most of it is basically funded from the homeowners themselves because it's just single family homes and they don't have the amenities. It may just be sidewalks or you know, one or two other little small things. So just to kind of give a gauge there, as I mentioned here, 60% of the communities fell in that 20 to 30% range. So you see that 20 to maybe even 35 is that window that's kind of on average. So what is a reserve study report? Really what we're trying to do is estimate the HOA's future capital needs. As I mentioned, roof replacement, building exterior, those larger expenses. And then we want to include the cost and the time estimate of when the repairs or replacements are going to be required over the next 20 years. So basically, we're trying to determine when things need to be replaced, how much it's going to cost, and how much funding needs to be set aside to pay for those. Part of the study itself involves evaluation of the condition of the association's assets. So we'll be looking at things like drainage systems, conditions of stormwater retention systems, asphalt, building components, the amenities, and really any of the association assets. When conducting one, we recommend that you use an engineer to actually conduct the site visit and the report writing, or at least be reviewing the report as a portion of kind of ownership of that report. But the individual that will be out on site will be looking at every component, determining the condition of it, how much lifeline is expected left on that item, and then eventually we'll put costing against it in the report as well. So as I mentioned, we're doing the physical evaluation, then we're doing the financial analysis. We're doing an analysis of the reserve fund and the reserve contribution rate. So that includes really looking at what's the current balance, how much is being put in now, adjusting for inflation, and then average returns on investments, which we'll kind of touch on in a minute. But we typically recommend if funds aren't needed now and you do have a reserve fund account, to try to put it into some sort of interest-bearing account instead of just having the money sitting there and not making, not at least trying to keep up with inflation rates. Then we're going to estimate the end of the year balance in the reserve fund for each of the next 20 years. So based on what's being allocated now and what the balance is currently, and then the future expenses, at the end of each year, we need to make sure that the fund obviously never goes to zero. There's multiple ways to look at it. We typically look at it a threshold, which can be recommending that you keep at least 1 times your average capital expenses or annual expenses in there at all times. So if you are spending $50,000 a year on average, that we recommend you keep at least $50,000 in there. You can also look at it as a zero threshold, that you don't want to see it. You don't care about how much is there, you just don't want to see it go negative. There's multiple ways to look at it. And then we're going to provide recommended funding alternatives to, as I mentioned, ensure the reserves are adequately funded for the next 20 years. And studies can go up to 30 years too. It's up to the community's preference. And ideally, when we're conducting the study, we want it to be a customized report for the community. So we're going to give a professional opinion on everything, and each provider should be doing this. And then once delivering a draft, you have the opportunity to go back through the report with the provider, answer questions, make necessary changes, maybe make changes to the recommended funding, depending on what the community would like to do with it. But they should be kind of customized to meet those needs of the community and put them in the best financial position going forward. Then included in the report also, it was kind of touched on here, should be some maintenance guidelines. The report includes observations on what was seen while on site, but it should include some suggestions on maintenance or replacement. And then obviously a schedule for non-annual maintenance repair items will be included in that narrative. So typical clients that conduct a reserve study, it's usually obviously HOAs and condo associations, which would include townhomes and villas, high rises, single family homes, those types of things. Occasionally we may have other clients such as country clubs or golf clubs, schools and community centers. That for their purposes, the same thing. They're trying to maintain an annual budget and determine what needs to be replaced on the road. So it's obviously a useful tool for them as well. So as I mentioned, I'm not going to go through the details of the report. That was kind of gone through recently. But what I am going to touch on real quick is just some of the importance of conducting reserve studies and then what's the benefit. So in terms of importance of conducting reserve studies, obviously one thing that we're trying to do and one of our goals is avoiding special assessments. No community likes to be told that their board hasn't been setting aside funds and now everybody needs to get the checkbook out and pay for new roofs. So ideally, a reserve study is conducted in advance of a community getting into a position where they basically run out of funds and have major projects coming up. So our goal is to get in front of that enough that we're setting aside enough reserves as needed for those replacements, and we don't get to the point that we do have to request money from the homeowners to pay for it. It's also a budgeting tool. It helps provide an accurate budget. Property managers and board members, you both know how the budget season can be. Really, we wanted you to look at it as a financial roadmap. So each year during the budget process, if a reserve study has been conducted, you have that tool in front of you to look at it and say, have we done these projects that were slated to be in 2020 or 2021? If we have not, how do we need to adjust our budget going forward? And if we have, what impact does that have? So it is a tool that I recommend is used. If you have a reserve study that's already completed, use it each year during your budgeting process, because it is a valuable tool, and really that's the reason that you did it, is to put yourself in a good position. So use that asset that you've obtained. Obviously, it helps predict future capital needs, sufficient funding for those needs, avoiding deferred maintenance. That's a pretty big one, and I'm sure it's been talked about in other seminars. But if the community is obviously able to keep up with their maintenance, they'll save a lot of money in the long run. I know it's tough when communities are asking for more money or increases in dues to continue to keep up with those assets. But in the long run, and I should probably put a chart on this sometime on some of our reports we've done in the past just to kind of prove a point, but that deferred maintenance eventually will cost the community more when, an example may be keeping up with roads or parking areas and letting that slide too far, that eventually, instead of just being able to do a resurfacing project, which may cost $15 a square yard or so, now you're looking at a project where you may have to do complete reconstruction, and the cost of that can be 4 to 5 times more expensive. So keeping up with the community, I can't stress enough, is very, very important. And obviously it kind of goes with the home values, as they see on that fourth one there as well. The better shape the community is, the more the homes are worth. Kind of speaks for itself. And then the other piece is complying with state laws. There's some laws, there's about, I think, 8 states in the United States that require reserve studies to be conducted by any HOA, which kind of speaks to the importance of them. But then there's other laws. Each state is a little bit different, but some require it. You may need it for funding if you get to the point that you do potentially need to get funding for a project. And then there's statutory laws as well, and some communities also have it written into their bylaws that it's something that they need to do and update on a regular basis. As I mentioned, kind of what's the cost of falling behind? These are just some examples of some communities actually in the St. Louis market. And speaking to that example I just talked about, this is a street in a community that's maintained by the association. They didn't do anything with these streets for years. You see a little bit of patchwork, but you can see the potholes and the surface deterioration. And obviously, when it gets to this point, they were unable to just do a simple resurfacing project or even mill the top off and resurface. I believe last estimates I saw that this project was looking at about $2 to $2.5 million in road work that was going to need to be done. So obviously it put them in a very, very tough situation financially. But if they had been able to keep up with things, it would have been a much more affordable project. But, that's kind of somewhat of a worst case scenario, but it does speak to the need of maintaining the community. As you see here, here's just another example of roof patching, missing shingles. Over time, they just haven't had the funds to replace the roofs. In this case, there were pretty significant roof leaks, and as the bylaws and for this community mentioned, the association is responsible for interior leaks from the roofs. So because they deferred replacing the roofs as long as possible, they ended up costing themselves a lot more just for interior repairs on these buildings as well. Just a couple more examples. I'll kind of click through these. You see some cedar shake siding here that, again, another community that is starting to have water intrusion because they weren't keeping up with painting and staining these components on the exterior of the building. Decks, that's another good example of ones that if keeping up with it, again, will save the community a lot of money in the long term. I come across a lot of decks that, if they're maintained on an annual basis and they're regularly stained and painted and structurally evaluated on an annual basis, potentially the decks could last up to 30, 40 years. I mean, we look at a 20-year life cycle on wood decks like this. But if it's kept up, it's just like anything, it's like an old car. If you keep up with it, it's still going to be in good condition and serviceable. When it gets to a point that the deterioration is this bad, repairs typically aren't an option, especially when it comes to requirements and county requirements. Major repairs and structural components, if the county inspector is taking a look as well, they're going to require that the decks are also brought up to code. And basically what that means is these decks were in code when they were built 20 years ago. And since they aren't able to do small repairs on them and they need to do larger structural repairs, the cost to bring them up to code is basically the same as replacing them. So in this case, they had to replace all of the decks throughout the community, even though they were only 20 years old. And again, that was another $500,000 project. So this kind of speaks to it. Here's some stair treads. Another concern is maybe not financial, but the life safety and the risk concern with not keeping up with maintenance. Kind of goes to the decks as well. They become unsafe at some point. These stair treads you see, the concrete is basically deteriorated to the point of failure. Now you're talking about a safety issue, which is even a bigger priority than the expenses related to it. Of course, nobody wants to see anybody injured, and the potential litigation and lawsuits that may follow that as well. It's just something to be aware of. Again, another example of not keeping up. There's a lot of water intrusion in this. You see the old cast iron piping in there. This community, because they weren't keeping up with the plumbing systems, I believe this is the same one, and the deterioration, the cost to replace all of the plumbing as opposed to doing it as needed was again, an over $1 million project. So make sure you're kind of expecting those things. The maintenance piece also needs to include the board members probably taking time once a year, or if you have a maintenance manager, go through the community, look at your assets, look at those things, and just do a visual inspection. Maybe do it twice a year. It takes a little bit of time out of your day, but it's worth itself, in the long run, not just for as I mentioned, the money saving, but also the potential injury risk and liability concerns there. Another one, or just you got to see retaining wall that's starting to slip. The soil behind it has moved, and retaining walls are another asset that, if the entire wall needs to be replaced, can be extremely, extremely expensive. So we recommend with retaining walls too, just kind of checking those anywhere from 3 to 5 years. Check behind them. You see at the top behind this wall how much it's slipped down below it. Look for deterioration up there or soil erosion. And at the bottom, check the bottom of the retaining walls and look for soil that's come out of the bottom. Then you'll know that potentially there's some movement or some soil that is moving through there. The best thing to do is get ahead of it. And then there's mitigation options as well, whether it's kind of retrenching behind it, put a swale behind those retaining walls to help with water flow. In worst case scenario, maybe have a consultant come out and take a look at the structure and the retaining wall itself, and kind of determine if anything needs to be repaired or looks like it's continuing to move over time. And I think this last one, this is just another example of drainage issues, not keeping up with drainage throughout the community. This is a pretty prevalent one that seems to fall behind. Our communities seem to fall behind on these in terms of keeping up with drainage components. It is imperative, and especially, I think everybody's probably familiar with the rain that we saw maybe 3 weeks ago. When those 10-year type rainfalls come and the drainage systems aren't in good working order, the results can be obviously catastrophic. But typically, we do see, and we've conducted a lot of studies in the last few weeks, trying to look at water intrusion issues, because we did see a lot of flooding throughout the community, just because systems became overwhelmed. So it's good to keep up on those types of things. Obviously, in this case, this used to be a detention basin that basically doesn't drain anymore, turned into a large, expensive project for this community. And rest kind of speaks for itself. So earlier I talked about why to conduct reserve studies. Now I kind of want to talk through some of the benefits. Some of these are a little bit repetitive, but from for example, the first one, maintaining property value. There's multiple reasons, why not keeping up with the reserve study or keeping up with your assets in the community can affect property value. But one of the main ones is the home value there in the community. It helps reduce those deferred maintenance costs, which I spoke of. It's proof of community health. So it's becoming more and more frequent now when new homeowners come in and buy a condo or a townhome or a villa, they may be looking they're smarter than they used to be. So we see a lot of examples where homeowners are coming in and they really want to see what the financial plan is, and they ask if a reserve study's been conducted. Knowing, and I think we could all agree, knowing as a homeowner buying a new property, that there's proof that the community is aware of their future expenses, that they're keeping up with them, they're maintaining the community, and they have a financial plan going forward, relieves a lot of buyer's angst. So that for itself is a selling point. It's proof of where the community is at, and it's just a good asset for the community to have and be able to provide when requested. Preserving appearance kind of goes along the same lines as the property value, and then proof of the community health. It gives you a comprehensive asset inventory. Obviously, when you conduct it, you're going to have the whole component list there, so you know everything that you need to be aware of. There's many times that communities may have system components that are going, reaching the end of their life that aren't on their radar, and it can be, kind of an eye-opening moment when those things fail, and they had no plan to replace those. Last thing, I mentioned the kind of fulfilling legal responsibility board. The board does have a fiduciary duty to preserve and kind of maintain the financial health of the community. And the other piece though is the cost sharing. So I have this pushback a lot when we go through reserve studies. The boards typically understand why they're being conducted because obviously they've requested one, but we do present them to communities after they've been completed and go through the complete home ownership group. And one of the things I hear a lot is, why should I replace it or pay for this to be replaced now? I'm not going to be here in 5 or 10 years. There's kind of two ways to look at it. One of those, in terms of, well, a lot of time actually I'll hear people say, I won't even be alive in 5 years, right? So, but those homeowners still do have equity in their home. And that equity is ultimately probably going to be passed on to somebody, whether it's a grandchild or somebody in a will, somebody's going to obtain that property. And if the equity in that property has lowered because the community is not maintaining themselves, a 5% reduction in equity on a $300,000 home is, $15,000 that next generation or whoever was passed along to has lost in value of that home. So there's that piece of it as well. But then, the other piece is you're paying for these assets as you use them. So if you're in a home for 10 years and you use the roof for 10 years, you've had the opportunity to use that. And by paying or allocating a portion of your dues into reserves over those 10 years, you're basically paying for it as you use it. So then the next person that comes into the home, now they're paying for the 10 years that they may be using it, as opposed to use it for 10 years, haven't set any funds aside for it, and then in 10 years there's a special assessment, and then somebody's taking the toll for that entire amount. That's just another reason why it's a benefit to try to get ahead of these and pay for them as you go. So the reports themselves, obviously CAI has standards for conducting reserve studies. It's recommended that a reserve specialist is at a minimum conducts the study. As I mentioned, we recommend actually seasoned engineers that have a little bit more experience with building components to conduct it as well. But those are requirements. I won't go through all of these, but these are the lists that CAI standards mention that associations should make sure that they're doing or is included in the report itself. You see the last one's kind of talking about following statute requirements, and you see those couple bullet points at the bottom. Missouri doesn't have any statutory requirements on conducting reserve studies. They're actually one of the loosest states in the country in terms of regulation there. But as you see, eight do require it, and then a number of those in between require something related to it or proof of community health that's part of their state statutory requirements as well. So again, just kind of speaks to the importance of conducting these studies and making sure that the community is in a good financial place. So I'm going to move on to the second part here. Kind of talk through the reserve studies themselves. This is kind of geared a little bit more towards maybe board members, but also property managers as well. Once the reserve study has been conducted, these are just kind of, I want to go through some thoughts and tips on presenting it to the board or the homeowners at an annual meeting. Everybody knows that, you know, some of the complications that can arise when going through annual meetings, those types of things. So we want to make sure that if a community is represented by a property manager, you know, the property manager might be trying to explain these to the HOA. If the board has conducted one on their own, they may be trying to explain the reserve study to the full membership. I'll go through, you know, our recommendation is to have the reserve study specialist or the provider attend it if possible. I know that's not always the case. But, you know, one of the things we kind of run into initially is, what if you have an old study or it was done earlier in the year and you're trying to present it and it's not accurate? This isn't as common, but sometimes providers, you know, maybe you just get a bad report, or maybe you have a provider that, you know, didn't vet the providers well enough, and you got one that you're just not comfortable with. When you're typically a reserve study, you should receive a draft and go through, you know, each component of it and make those necessary changes before accepting a final draft. I know some providers may send the report. You may have a chance to change a couple things, and then that's it. So if you're in a position where, you know, the accuracy is not quite where it needs to be, obviously you want to ask right away for corrections. If it's been done somewhat recently, go back to the provider and say, hey, maybe we got to change, or, you know, maybe there's some inaccuracies, but request that they do make those corrections. The next thing you want to do is make sure that the adjustments in funding follow projected year-end balances. So if you've done those adjustments, you know, check those year-end balances, make sure that you're still in a good financial place. And then if you're not able to do those other and you need an update, obviously most providers provide an option for a reserve study update, in which case there's two options. There's going to be one without a site visit, which we wouldn't want to request, or we wouldn't recommend. It's going to be cheaper, but, you know, as professionals in our industry, I always recommend, you know, have somebody there that's taking physical inventory of the components, that's looking at them, that's understanding the condition, instead of just relying on an update on the figures, which kind of goes into the other piece, which is obviously updating with the site visit. So the board meeting review, there we go. Might have to save slides here. There we go. So when reviewing the report with the board, the first thing is prepare, right? Send the report to the board, request that it's reviewed, and provide a list of questions back. So you already have an outline of what you're going to kind of go through. Everybody's familiar with it. And then you can address those questions while you're there. Sometimes reserve studies can be uncomfortable because a lot of time we are recommending an increase in ownership dues. So, you know, just be aware of that, because it can get sticky and occasionally contentious. It's best to prepare, have those lists of questions so that it's, you know, able to keep those conversations as cordial as possible. Have the reserve study provider attend the meeting or a conference call to review the initial report. So kind of when you're going through it as a board, collect those things. If you don't plan on presenting it to the full membership, at least have the reserve study provider attend the board meeting as you go through it, or call in if it's an out-of-town one. And then there's going to be two parts to that review. One, really focus on the projected capital repair expenses. There's a lot of meat that goes into the narrative of the report. That's, you know, keep those conversations are more probably geared towards sidebar conversations. So outside of this meeting, to kind of keep things flowing, I recommend take a look at the capital repair needs and what are those expenses that were provided in the report, and then look at the funding models to determine obviously what the funding recommendations are. And as you go through those component lists, you have an opportunity to maybe make some changes there, go through those models, see if they're accurate. You may want to approach it financially from a different situation, or say, well, let's look at another alternative that we increase our dues a little bit. Just give an example. We increase our dues a little bit more now so that down the road we don't have to continue to to do it every year. We can maybe increase it only every 2 years. Things like that. Those are conversations to kind of go through when reviewing the report. And then the last piece is review it annually as part of the budgeting process. I already talked about this, but during your budget process, I recommend compare the year-end balances to where you're at now. So at the end of 2020, what were you projected to be at in the report, and where are you actually at, so that you can make those needed adjustments if necessary. And then look at your projected expenses versus what your actual expenses were. Same thing, you know, we're trying to determine what was completed, what needs to be completed next year. It gives you that kind of that roadmap. If you're keeping up with it or things even get deferred, you know that going into next year, here's what's on the, you know, the docket per se, that we're looking at a pool resurfacing, we're looking at maybe some asphalt resurfacing, some drainage repairs. You have that list there in front of you. Go out and take a look at those components. Maybe they are in better shape than initially thought, or they may be worse. As I mentioned though, about walking once a year, go out there, double check how the condition of those things. Maybe we have a painting schedule coming up in all the buildings scheduled for next year, but things are in pretty good condition. We think we can move it to 2022, but then maybe you have something in 2022 that's needs to be addressed now. So you have that cash balance, so you have a little bit of flexibility, but use that as an opportunity to plan and schedule what you're going to do on a year-to-year basis. So the annual meeting review. I'm going to duplicate that one too. Let's talk about speaking with the board. The annual meeting review is going to include, obviously, the full ownership group. As I mentioned, review ahead of time. At this point, the report should not be in draft form. It should be finalized. You should have made the adjustments that you would wanted to make to the report. It should be completely wrapped up before reviewing it with the community. So as I mentioned before, you don't want to go through the whole report. Typically, I would look at the component list and kind of go through those and then the financial recommendations. So review and highlight the major expenses identified in the reserve study. If there's a lot of component expenses, you may not need to spend time on each one. Maybe you just kind of focus on the larger ones, as I said, roofs, pools, those types of things, elevators, that are really driving the financial recommendations. So kind of stick to those. Review and highlight the total over-term expenses. So that's something that usually helps sink in with an ownership group. Why do I need to increase dues $20 a month? Well, look at the 20 years. With inflation, you're looking at $1.5 million in future expenses. How are we going to pay for $1.5 million in future expenses when we're only allocating $10,000 a year into our reserve accounts? So that large number obviously kind of helps communicate what the importance of the study, but also those future funding. Review the current funding. The study should show you where you're at now and what that looks like over the next 20 years. So review that as well. Show them, here's the current funding, and down the road we go negative in 5 years. So that's why we are recommending these increases. Again, it's kind of just speaks to the narrative and helps explain the report itself. Review the funding plans or the alternatives that were recommended by the provider, and then really explain to the community what happens if we don't follow this plan. I know nobody wants to spend more money, but if we don't, we're looking, there's a laundry list. I just put 3 of them on here, but you're obviously deferred expenses and costing yourself more over time. You may be looking at special assessments. Either we bump everybody up $20 a month now, or we're going to need a $5,000 check from everybody in 5 years. What does that look like? And then obviously you kind of speak to the equity piece, the home values, the aesthetic appeal of the community, those types of things. And then, so one last kind of slide here I want to talk about for the reserve studies and kind of reviewing them once they're completed. How to sell a reserve study. So, a board or board members or a property manager, they may understand the importance and they may be interested in trying to get the community to do one. And there's always going to be pushback because nobody wants to spend unnecessary money. But just some thoughts on trying to help explain the importance of them. As I mentioned, to fellow board members or a community in general. What I recommend is at least obtain some proposals. Those are free. You could say, hey, let's at least look at the cost. It doesn't mean we have to do anything, Well, let's see what we get from providers. And then at that point, let the provider sell it. I recommend this to communities all the time, and I offer this service all the time. And people don't typically tend to take me up on the offer, but you know, we may attend a board meeting. You know, provide a proposal, and if you want to meet with us or another provider, whether, you know, even if somebody that's out of town, or even a conference call. Next annual meeting, if it's something you're seriously discussing, loop the providers in, have them just join you for 10 minutes on the call, or even meet in person if it's an option, and just kind of go through it. Say, you know, introduce themselves, you get to know the person, determine, you know, maybe you're comfortable with them and the services, and they can explain it to the board, or, you know, anybody in attendance that may have some reservations. They can probably explain it to them a little bit better, to maybe, you know, kind of help with some of those, ease some of those concerns and anxiety about conducting the study. So let the provider sell. You know, and then there's just kind of some of the selling points, you know, whether we're being proactive versus reactive. That's part of what's expected from the board members, is to stay on top of the community's, you know, financial and condition needs. So it's part of the duty, and it shows that you're taking the responsibility to be proactive about these types of things. And again, it's a planning tool. It helps plan for the future. It helps with your funding. Helps prevent special assessments, which we've kind of talked about some of these bullet points previously. But, you know, these are reasons why a community wants to be proactive, as opposed to trying to manage it themselves. You know, appearance gets you out of any financial hole you may be in. You know, it's never too late, I guess, to get your financials in a good position. I have communities all the time that maybe they're past the point of too late, but you know, nothing's going to change. They still have expenses that need to be addressed. So as hard as it can be to bite the bullet, sometimes you just have to. And then, you know, some other rebuttals, obviously, people may have kind of their head in the sand about these kinds of things. And they may say we have plenty of money in the reserves, but I just actually had a conversation with somebody last night that a community that did the same thing. They had over $700,000 in their reserves. They thought they had plenty. They stopped allocating. Board members changed over time, and they didn't do anything. And now they have $50,000 in there. They're not putting anything in the reserve account on the side, and they have $2 million of roof projects replacement projects. So, you know, they're in a terrible position. So before you can say you have enough money in the reserves, you have to know the amount of expenses that are coming up over the next 20 years. And getting to $1 million balance to pay for $1 million roof replacement is not something that can be done in a year. It takes time. You may have $700,000 in the bank account, but you have $1 million project coming up in 3 years. So make sure you understand that full 20-year picture before you try to believe that there's enough money in the reserves. A couple other quick points I'll touch on. We can do it ourselves. I understand that, and hey, I will say if a community doesn't want to pay for one and they're trying to do it themselves, at least they're doing something. It's better than doing nothing. You know, they're trying to put together a financial plan. I would still recommend that over nothing. But individuals that try to do it themselves, obviously, for one, they most likely don't have that professional experience of really understanding the conditions of components, having good cost tables to understand what those, get accurate cost replacements. You say we got to replace the roofs, or, we may have major elevator repairs. Somebody that doesn't understand the major mechanical upgrades and replacements that go into those, may not know they could be looking at a $100,000 project down the road. So there's the costing piece. And then lastly, a lot of time that I've seen communities do it on their own, they're almost incentivized to understate the future expenses. So Matt, put yourself on a board and you decide you want to do the reserve study yourself and try to get a financial idea of where they're at. You're more than likely, you're going to understate it because you don't want to go back to the community and say, you know what, we did an in-house study and we think, we need to allocate twice as much as we've been doing previously. It's uncomfortable. That's why you have providers to help explain that and communicate that to communities. And a lot of time, board members, one, they don't want to have to explain that to the community, so they'll understate the cost. And then, two, they won't get as much buy-in from the community as well, because the community is typically going to say, well, that's your opinion. I don't agree. So just be aware of that. And then obviously you're going to get, rebuttals on it's making us raise the dues. I've gone through enough examples of that to kind of go through those again, but those are some of the rebuttals to be aware of. Okay. Take a drink of water real quick. So we've kind of gone through reserve studies to a degree and kind of selling them and how to communicate them. Now that we've completed the study though, where do we go from here? I want to kind of touch on some of the next steps that would recommend, and also kind of dealing with some contractors and contracts. Great Tom Landry here is a quote from him. He's saying, setting a goal is not the main thing. So you have a goal here with the reserve study, but as he says, it's decided how you will go about achieving it and staying with that plan. So just because you have a reserve study doesn't mean you've implemented it, obviously, at this point. So you got to implement the reserve study properly in order for it to actually, to gain the quality of what the study itself, it's as important as obtaining a quality study to begin with. So if you get it, first, make sure you're getting quality study, but second, you have to implement these plans. So what now? Financial analysis and funding plan serves as a kind of a measure of current condition. So this plan is giving you an idea of the condition of your community, and it's also there to serve as a financial roadmap. Don't just look at the bottom line to determine what your monthly reserve funding should be. So in the study, you're probably going to have the end of the year expenses for each year going forward. Don't just look at that and assume that we have $100,000 of work next year. We should be setting this much aside to be able to pay for it. One that's not listed here is some of those future expenses down the road could be, very large projects coming up in 3 years. So don't look at those bottom line, and things change. When you conduct a reserve study, you're looking through a crystal ball to a degree. You're trying to look out 20 years in the future, but things change. Obviously, we try to, and most providers they'll put in an inflation factor, but inflation rates change. Replacement costs can change dramatically in a short time. This year is a great example of the cost of wood. With everything that's been going on these last few months, production's been reduced so much that I've seen some reports that the cost of lumber from April until now has gone up over 100%. So those are things that can't be captured at the time of the study that you need to be aware of. So that's why you do need to stay on top of the study. Don't look at the bottom line. Be aware of these things. You may have unexpected expenses that come up. So there's variables that are still continuing to flow through these studies over time that require you to try to keep it updated as much as possible. As mentioned, each piece of the puzzle has to fit together for this plan to work. Everything we're going through is a piece of that puzzle. And then, lastly, make sure you're following the recommended contribution plan that the reserve study provided for you. I understand for a lot of communities that recommended increase may not be achievable year one. I know it's tough, but do everything in your power to continue to try to get to those recommendations. Not using those, saying, okay, that's great. I appreciate what the plan has shown us here. And then not doing anything about it is, there's no point. We shouldn't have even done a study at that point. It's detrimental to the community. The recommended contributions, that plan that's been developed for your community has been developed for a reason, and it's gone through a modeling system that has accurate costs and it has accurate timelines, and just recommend using it. It's very imperative. But what if you don't have a plan? So you've conducted the reserve study, as I was talking about. You have recommendations, but you don't have, currently you're not doing anything. Obviously, the first step is establish a funding plan immediately. Look at what was recommended, follow that plan, do everything you can to get in that position. As I kind of mentioned there, it's the fiduciary duty of the board to maintain the financial health of the community. If you have no immediate large expenses, take what you have in the reserve account and deposit it in an interest-bearing account. It shouldn't just be sitting there, stagnant. When there is an opportunity at a minimum, add 1% on it each year. It's not obviously financially prudent to just kind of sit on that money. Find a interest-bearing CD or something to put it in to earn, at least earn a little bit of money on it. If you do need funds now and your balance is zero, Unfortunately, now you're at a point where you probably have recommended increases, but the funds aren't there at all. Maybe roofs are replaced next year and you got nothing. Try to follow that plan, but if the funds are needed now, you're down to two options, which is securing a loan, through a bank provider, or conducting special assessments throughout the community. So unfortunately, communities get to that point, they don't have another option. But these are the kind of steps to go along if you don't have a current plan yet. Next up, develop a preventative maintenance schedule. So this kind of goes along with what I was talking about earlier, looking at at least once a year. I recommend twice a year, walk through the community, look at the conditions, just keep up with the condition of those components. Things change. These major rains, as I mentioned, there are drainage components in communities that you don't see on a day-to-day basis that, are part of the drainage structure, but they may be, off-site and not visual. Go down and check those. You may have seen a retaining wall may have shifted and you don't realize it, or things may have backed up, and next thing you know, you're having flooding issues. So stay on top of that, maintain that list, walk the property, and that way you don't risk falling further behind on your maintenance and your reserve funding plans. If you're not doing that preventative maintenance and you don't have that schedule built, eventually it's going to cost you more, and then you're going to continue to fall behind. Even if you're in a position where you're starting to get yourself out of that hole, you got to keep up with the maintenance too. And then update the reserve study every 3 to 5 years. As I mentioned, things change. Conduct those maintenance kind of walkthroughs, and then have a professional service provider come out, look at them again, update the financials. Things have changed since then, and how the funds need to be allocated, and the timing of those future replacements have changed. So again, have a quality study provided by an engineer preferred, at least a reserve study specialist, and then that way they can capture those changes to inventory and inflation, building technology changes, and maybe an owner preference change. Maybe the community wants to do a rehab on a clubhouse that wasn't in the previous study. So we're capturing new things on that inventory list, or maybe reducing some as well over time. And just kind of a quick table here. As I mentioned, preventative maintenance, just a way to look at kind of a flow chart on those things. I would look at this, going through each annual walkthrough. Again, kind of looking at the condition of like roofs, ducts, HVAC, and asphalt, those types of things. And I won't go through this in too much, but it kind of shows the flow chart of, is it a reserve study or reserve item, or is it maintenance? And at the bottom there, you see, regardless if it's an annual operating expense or a long-term capital replacement expense, they should still be on a preventative maintenance there at the bottom. Okay. So, now you've identified those projects, you're keeping up with them, and we need to identify contractors. We need individuals to come out and perform the services. So as I mentioned, once you understand the study, we got to find contractors to help do the work. So the first step with these projects is defining what you want to do. Ask yourself questions. Think of any variables within the scope of the project that may need to be aware of. So you're defining what the project is. Try to ask yourself as many questions as possible at this point. You're basically, nothing's off the table. Brainstorm, capture every variable, so that you're getting as much detail as you can going into it. But what are we going to do? Why are we doing it? What should it look like? The other things to consider when they're doing the work. How is it going to affect the inside and the outside? How will they treat it while they're doing the work? What's our budget, and when do we want to start? So you're defining the scope of the project, kind of getting your arms around the parameters here. The next step is you're going to want to discuss the project with contractors. Now that you've identified what needs to be done, and you're starting to solicit contractors, we recommend identifying at least 3 contractors. As the scope of the project and the expense goes up, you may want to identify more than 3, but rely on assets that you may have to identify quality contractors. So your property manager, they probably have a list of contractors that they've worked with in the past. They're a resource. Obviously, the CAI Heartland Directory is a resource for contractors. Attorneys and loan officers and engineers, specifically with us, with engineers, we work with a lot of contractors because we're involved in almost any type of scope of project throughout all of these HOA communities. So obviously they're a great resource. If you have an attorney that works for me, ask them for some recommendations. And we love to provide recommendations as well. At least you have resources that are going to give you reliable contractors or recommendations, as opposed to trying to go through an Angie's List and filter through 100 potential contractors. And then obviously word of mouth. Kind of the same thing with getting recommendations through here, but maybe there's other opportunities or board members that have worked with contractors in the past that they could recommend. Then I take time to talk to each contractor. If it's a small project, maybe it's not as big of a deal, but if you're doing roofs and those types of things, it's okay to talk to each three of these contractors. Get 3 bids from them, but ask for 10, 30 minutes of their time. Say, can we just talk about this? You're not making a commitment at this point, but it gives you a better feel for the contractor. I can't tell you how many times meeting with people can completely change the viewpoint of the project and the comfort level with that contractor, and knowing that you're working now with somebody that is adequate for the job that you're trying to get accomplished. So ask them questions about maybe what they think about the project or any ideas they may have. You'll get an idea of their knowledge base, but they also may have some ideas that you want to include in the scope that you hadn't thought of previously. So just have that general conversation. We're not asking them to come into a meeting, maybe just a quick phone call. But I always recommend that with contractors. It's pretty beneficial in determining which one to go with. So now you've kind of started that communication process and you're looking for proposals. Define every detail of the project at this point. Again, think of everything. Ask yourself as many questions as you can think of and attempt to answer them all. What's the budget? What's our schedule? What hours of the day do we want them to work, or is it okay for them to work? Are they going to clean up every night after they're done? Are there other conditions we need to consider, environmental conditions, whether it's impacting the environment around or it's blocking traffic? How are we dealing with these things each? What other costs are we not considering at this time? There's a lot of variables that you get to a phase in the project, it's like, oh shoot, I didn't think of that. What needs to be prepared before starting? What are our timing restrictions? Again, just consider all those variables, spitball them, brainstorm, make sure you're thinking of everything going into this. And then at that point, you've defined those things, you provide them to the providers, the contractors. Now check references. You may have narrowed it down to 2 providers at this point, depending on comfort level, but once you've kind of narrowed it down to 2, maybe you're still at 3 or maybe you're at 1. Regardless, check references, obtain at least 3 references from these providers. And again, I'm speaking towards larger projects essentially, not little small things, but it's always good to have references. Try to get 2 from clients that have had this work done by this provider like 3 to 5 years ago. A lot of times things may look great, and 3 to 5 years, they go back and say, you know what, this was actually a shoddy job, or they didn't pour the asphalt as thick as they said they would. Things pop up over time that really identify qualities of the project that you weren't able to see from the get-go. So I recommend getting somebody that's been done just a few years in the past. Then you kind of get an idea of how they work now, but also what's the quality. Be thorough in your questions with them. And then ask reference if that you've maybe been given. So if you have a reference that you're given, some questions to ask them. Ask them if they're comfortable working with the contractor. If the work was done neatly and on time. Did they come within budget, or was there scope changes that they requested? And what was the quality? Was it what we expected? Those types of simple questions really help define the quality of the contractor. Now we're at the point of selecting a proposal. Now that we've defined the project, go back to at least 2 of the contractors and get them to do a proposal. These are just a list of some things to consider on there. There's obviously a lot longer list that goes into the proposal, but make sure obviously you're defining the total price of the project, that there's no hidden potential expense concerns there. Check the method of billing. How are they going to bill? Are they going to bill on a monthly basis? Will be based on percentage completion. Define that billing schedule and what that payment schedule ultimately will look like. specifically who will be working on the project. There's a lot of time you may have a contractor that you've selected and they subcontract it. The next thing you know, the people that are completing the work on this project, you haven't met. You may not have a project manager on site to speak to with questions. So make sure you're defining who specifically. Will it be subcontracted? Will it be them? Will it be their employees? Will it be in-town people or out-of-town employees? And then who is going to be our point of contact throughout this project? These are things that need to be defined ahead of time, and it'll save you a lot of headache in the long term. What does your daily schedule look like? What time will you start? What time will you finish? How will you clean up? What days will you be working of the week? Obviously, when are you going to start and when are you going to finish? Trying to define as much as possible helps keep them on track for this project and keep the expenses within budget. And then let's see. And again, this kind of just defines the scope a little bit, but what they plan to do to complete your project. It may take 10 phases of work, and you need to understand that. It's going to start that we're going to mill the surfaces of these roads between these two streets. And it's going to take us a week to do it. Traffic's going to need to flow another direction or go out another entrance, and then we'll overlay. Then we move on to the next section. What does that look like? If we're replacing decks on multiple buildings, are we doing all the decks on one building first, or are we doing demolition on every building and then building them back up? Those are things that need to be done and defined. And lastly, just trust your intuition. I can't speak enough about actually kind of just following your gut and how important that can be to selecting a reserve study or a contractor. Hey, Kathy, I got a quick question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I just wanted to double check. I've been speaking for a while now. I prefer to use kind of an earbud. My speaker doesn't pick up sound very well. But one of them, was kind of dying, so I took one out. You could hear everything I was saying recently, right?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, perfect. Just dawned on me. Wanted to make sure I wasn't on mute the last two slides.
No, you're doing great. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And I know, let's see, we've got about 30 minutes left, so I'll kind of get through this piece and then we'll go through, get to where we can. But a little bit more, once we've selected the proposal, kind of went through that piece. The next step is going to be signing an agreement. After you've picked your contractor, ask them to compile a summary of your agreement. That summary, you want them to reiterate that summary back to you. So when will it start? When will it finish? You've defined it, but they need to tell you that as well. Who will be working on it? As I mentioned, who's the point of contact? Who are the employees, the contractors that are going to be on site swinging the hammers? These are things I talked about earlier. They need to say, here's when we will arrive. Here's when we'll leave. Here's how we'll clean up. Here's what materials we're going to be using. We're going to be storing lumber on site because we're redoing decks. Here's where we're going to store it. Here's how much will be there. Again, they need to reiterate what's the total cost of the project. And then one of the major things too is insurance. Make sure that they're providing you with insurance, that adequate insurance, that that you're not putting yourself in any type of liability situation with this contractor. The biggest picture is just be aware of what you're signing. If you have an attorney or representation, we deal with contracts a fair amount, but I'm not an attorney. I'm not an expert in this area. If you have financial representation within your community, or you have access to one, I highly recommend having your attorney review the contract prior to signing it. Just make sure there's nothing in there that, that is a major concern that, might bite you in the end. So just make sure you're doing that due diligence there. I listed kind of a little list here of some areas that have standard forms for contracts. I don't always recommend using a standard form, but if you don't have anything in place, at least it's something to compare against if you're receiving a contract from the contractor. To make you have a list now of things that are typically included in those to make sure that those are being captured as well. So that list, I won't go through them, but they all have on their website at least standard forms for contracts that you can use as a reference for future projects. And then now that the project started, monitor progress. Monitor the project. Stay in communication with the contractor. You want to have somebody on site or a project manager there that you can speak with on a regular basis to answer questions, give you feedback. Maybe they have concerns or things that they need they need answers on. Stay in contract, monitor the project so you know that they're staying on track. Obviously the liability here, don't ever offer to help out. That's their job. They're there to do the work. Nobody else should be helping them physically on this project. Be involved, but handle criticism tactfully. So remember, you're the boss. So I kind of mentioned a bullet point a couple down, but be tactful with them. But remember, you're the boss. So if you have concerns or things that you want to address or change, or you're not comfortable with, relay that information. Don't be a jerk about it. That's not going to help the project. But this is your project. They're working for you. So stay in contact and communicate those concerns. But again, kind of just make sure you're doing it tactfully. Any issue that you see though, then again, do it right away. If there's a concern, contact them. When I say right away, not immediately. Don't go running out there with a whistle and chase them down, but don't wait a week to bring it up. At that point, it may be too late. But so, within the next day or so, and maybe you have, sometimes we'll have projects where we just have updates, once a week to go through things. Make sure you're addressing those in a timely manner. And then once all that's completed, accept the project formally upon completion. So provide a note or a letter that says you've accepted the work. That way it's signed by both parties. It's formally at that point closed. Likely that'll require final payment, but make sure that you have something that documents that the project is final. It works for both parties, and it just helps wrap up the project as well and avoid, not likely, but avoid any potential, litigation or back and forth down the road. And then the last thing I said is kind of going that litigation thing. Avoid litigation at all costs. Follow these kind of the monitor progress thing I just went through. It'll help avoid any future legal issues. If you're staying on top of it, if you're working with the contractor, litigation, 99 out of 100 times it's more costly in the end. You're paying dues for engineer evaluations and lawyers and legal fees and all those things that come along with it. In the end, it's going to cost you more money every time. The only time that I would even recommend it is if only as your last resort. If something major happened and you're not able to resolve it in any way, that's a last resort. Or if there's some sort of injury or catastrophe that happened, at that point there may be litigation requirements. But try your best to avoid it by staying involved in these projects and staying on top of them. How are we doing on time? Okay, 25 minutes. So as I mentioned, I didn't think I'd be able to get to those transition studies. I'll provide some documentation on that after this. What I want to go through real quick though on the COVID piece is, because I want to leave some time for questions here too. These are just some, obviously what's been going on with COVID over the last 6 months. Some of this may be repetitive in terms of combating those types of things, but there is an air quality component as well I wanted to go through. Many communities have clubhouses that maybe have been, obviously they have clubhouses, but maybe they've been shut down for 3 months. They're trying to reopen them. What are the safety precautions we need to take to reopen them back up to the community, or just the interior conditions of the condominium units that homeowners may live in? How do we kind of help from a sanitary perspective as well, and air quality perspective? What are things that can be done to help mitigate risk and also to help open these buildings back up? So I want to go through that kind of quickly here. Planning now to maintain a building health and well-being. Managing your building in the corona world it's a new challenge. Everybody's we're going through this, by the seat of our pants as we go here, but we're learning more as we go. What opportunities do we have to coordinate, to help with the sanitation and the sanitation practices, the air quality stuff? The first thing is, these are probably things that are already been implemented within some of these communities, but coordinate the sanitation practices with owners and occupants. I can't recommend enough just open communication. It's, posting signs that are just a constant reminder that, hey, we have a capacity limit now at this point. We have hand sanitizers here. We also need to be aware that we have a traffic flow recommendations, those types of things. We're looking at clubhouses, pools, even common areas within the buildings. Coordinate those sanitation practices, and then also, make sure that you're communicating that regularly throughout the community. Kathy, can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Provide social distancing solutions. You know, as I mentioned, these are probably areas that have been addressed already, but you know, you have high traffic flow areas, and then you have occupancy restrictions likely now. So just make sure that you've had those conversations about what those solutions would be to make sure that the social distancing is still able to be obtained. As I mentioned, I'm going to go through improving air quality. A lot of that is through dilution and filtration. It's about circulating fresh air throughout the community or throughout those interior buildings, and then also using filtration systems that may help with some of these contaminants that are in the air. And then, as I mentioned earlier, communicate your good faith efforts to occupants. The community wants to know that you're, you know, that they're in good hands, and the board members there, or property managers, either one, are doing, you know, good faith efforts to maintain health and safety in the community. Just reassure with those efforts. And so where do we start? Obviously, each building's different. A lot of condo associations and homeowner associations are conversions as well. So it's important to know the history of the buildings and how that affects trying to make the building as safe as possible. So inventory your building, understand the history on it. You know, like I said, sometimes there's conversions, but really understand it, inventory it, and then has that building been completely closed? If your clubhouse has been closed for the last 4 months and you're trying to open it up, you know, there are things to consider, which we'll get to in a minute, but are there special opening prevention measures that you need to consider? So I'll touch on those in a minute. And then again, there may be limits on what you can do. You can only do so much but what we're trying to go through here are opportunities that we've identified that can help. So what affects your opportunities for your building? Obviously the age of the building, the types of windows. You know, these are all things that you have to consider in terms of air quality and those types of things. What's the HVAC system and the configuration? What's the tenant occupancy and density restrictions? Where are areas of high density that we need to be aware of for future, you know, airflow and social distancing guidelines? What's the construction type and the architectural features? So these are all things that questions you need to ask before trying to, you know, conduct these air quality evaluations. Now preparing, as I mentioned, we'll talk about preparing a closed building for opening. So if your clubhouse or anything in interior has been closed, before opening it, you know, flush out the existing air with the HVAC systems. Turn on your circulatory fans, open the windows. It's likely that the clubhouse or other features may have adjusted the HVAC systems back depending on the weather conditions. So, you know, maybe just for energy efficient savings, the air has not been running through there. And then same thing with the water. It may have been shut down or hasn't been used, has been stagnant for 6 months. So ensure that, you know, you've set back your water temperatures and your airflow back to where they need to be and flush them out prior to opening. So review those setback pieces, flush out the potable water systems, eliminate any bacteria. As I mentioned, you got stagnant water that's been sitting there for a long time. We need to flush that out. So make sure that from an air perspective, we recommend that if it hasn't been open in a couple months, run the air systems for at least 48 hours to flush all that out. And the same thing with the water. I would recommend flushing the water for 6 hours. I know it seems a little extreme, but ultimately you're making sure that you're clearing out all of that bacteria and anything that's been sitting in there a while. Your drain traps over time have probably been stagnant and have gotten mildew and other bacteria growing in it. We want to flush those out. Also, going back to those set points, there's a good chance that water's been shut off, or at least hot water's been reduced while the building's been closed to conserve energy. Make sure you get the water temperatures back up to adequate levels so that you have high temperature water flowing through there as much as possible to help flush out those bacteria. For the social distancing piece, consider your traffic flow in the buildings. What type of use is the building? Consider signs as a reminder, as I mentioned. You can even include outdoor areas like tennis courts and bocce ball courts, those things, just a simple reminder, signage that, hey, we're trying to maintain either a density level or occupancy level or distancing. So what's the type of the building? What is the traffic density? Where are the bottlenecks in these buildings? Obviously, entrances and exits, elevators. You've probably seen it regularly, restricting how many people can be in an elevator at a time. Lobbies, restrooms, those types of things. So just take inventory of that, understand where those areas are that need to be identified, and then put together those social distancing guidelines. And then opportunities. What can we do? Do we need to close off common areas where people can congregate or congregate too much? Do we need to modify traffic flow in narrow corridors? Do we need to encourage use of stairs instead of elevators? And then, as I mentioned again, kind of going through the sign thing, just add signs to limit the elevators to one person at a time or family members, those types of things, and just kind of constant reminders throughout there. Develop that plan, implement it. So define what's the social distancing, what's include, does that include the use of masks? Likely it does. Establish occupancy density. How much can we have in a building? Provide the signage, communicate the plan with the owners. As I mentioned, use these guidelines to communicate to the community, so at least they know that you're doing what needs to be done as well, and that safety of the occupants is the #1 priority. So make sure you're staying on top of these and communicating those things. As I mentioned, kind of repeating it here a little bit, but improving the air quality. These are things that need to be identified. What type of system do you have? Is it heat only? Is it water or air? All HVAC systems operate in different ways. Is the heat? Do you have heat and air conditioning? Are they combined? Are they? Do you have one air handler that works, or are you separated? Do you have condensers on the outside of the building and your furnaces on the inside? These are things that need to be taken inventory before you determine how to improve your air quality. For a heat-only building, which typically is more in the north, you may only have use of operable windows, or do you have mechanical ventilation? Use those systems, identifying them, and then what can we do to flush the air out? Is it opening the windows? Do we have mechanical ventilation that we can use? And then what kind of control systems do we have? If we have a fan that can be used on a regular schedule, use those control systems to bring in outside air. And look for areas that dilute the air. Can you increase the outside air into the building? So it's opening dampeners, it's eliminating recirculation. A lot of buildings work on recirculation of air to save energy, but we've kind of done some studies on this, and reducing recirculation or bringing in 50% more exterior air actually only really equates to about 5% more energy use. So you may spend a little bit more money, but you're getting 50% more air into that building for the time being to help dilute the air and keep things as clean as possible there. Restrooms, fans, they don't recirculate. So any restroom fans, those fans go to the exterior. So if there's an opportunity to help flush the building by running, maybe you do it during certain times of the day, but running fans in the restrooms, that helps vent the air, and it's putting it to the outside. So that's another opportunity for helping with getting air outside of the building. As I mentioned, you have operable windows. Establish a schedule for keeping them open when the weather permits. You're bringing in fresh air, it's helping. I mentioned the restroom fans. Is the air shared? Does each tenant or occupied area have independent air systems? Or there are some that share air circulation systems. So those are things that need to be considered within these as well. And then filtration. I just got a couple more slides here to go through, and then we'll go through some questions. But look for areas to improve your filtration. Can you keep those fans running 24/7? What type of filters do you have? A lot of communities have what's called a MERV 8 filtration system. It's lower quality, it's cheaper, and it's very common. So we recommend, at least for now, upgrading to maybe MERV 13 graded filtration systems. It's a higher quality filter. It's essentially the same size as the current filters, those MERV 8s, but so they're easy to replace. They cost a bit more, but they filter out an extremely higher percentage of bacteria and things in the air. Replace them at least quarterly. Inspect the ductwork for leaks and filter bypass. Obviously ductwork that has gaps in it, your air is no longer going through that filtration system. So when it's circulating through there, it's not cleaning it out as it should. Also check the filter bypass. So where the filter is in your HVAC systems, We kind of did some numbers on these too. A half-inch gap around a filter will cause 25% of the air flowing through there to bypass it. So you don't realize how much that little gap, because the filter slows down the air. So it's trying to force itself through there. Occasionally, if you have a stronger filtration system, you may actually have to increase the rate of airflow. But because it's flowing at such a rate that little half-inch gap can, 25% of the air is now going through that gap. So make sure you're checking those gaps that ensure all of the airflow through the community actually is going through your filtration systems. And again, just develop a plan for air quality, communicate that plan. Again, circulate the information on this. Let them know this is what we're doing. We've improved our filtration system. We're trying to dilute the air in here. We're doing these things from a safety perspective for the community and also for use of these buildings that we want to open back up. And then again, provide the signage, show them what you're doing, identify those modifications, call them out, showing that you're also demonstrating good faith effort and that their safety is #1 priority. Again, it's important to provide a safe environment, understand where you're at with your building and implementing these programs. So in summary, sanitize, disinfect, coordinate that with your owners, manage your social distancing, dilute the air. I won't go through these again, but these are just a summary of each of them. You have the list in your hand after the call, and then work on your filtration system. So managing that social distancing, cleaning the air, and then filtrating the air. And then I'm going to touch on this real quick. I had a question come up that, should communities push off projects right now because of COVID-19? It's not an answer that there's a definite solution to, a question there's a solution to. So it depends on the project. Life safety concerns, structural issues, water infiltration, things like that, those need to be addressed immediately. Those should not be deferred or delayed, even during these times right now. Just make sure with your contractors that you have working with them that you have, make sure you communicate with them and they communicate it back to you that there is a safety precautions that are going to be implemented. So if they're working inside, that they're always wearing masks and they're going to be limited to so many population density with workers. Those types of things need to be identified. But if it's a deferred maintenance thing that can be put off temporarily, now I'm not speaking to long-term, but maybe it's a roof replacement project that's supposed to start now, or asphalt repairs. Let's say interior painting on a building is a perfect example. You had scheduled to do this year, you're not comfortable yet, you can put it off till next year. That's fine. If there's concerns that you don't want other people in the building, but just make sure you're not putting these off too far. And as I mentioned here, develop and communicate a list of protocols with your vendors that they're expected to follow. That's imperative for the projects that we're trying to work on now. And lastly, in summary, every building's different and offers unique opportunities. Some are more limited to others, and obviously your objective though is to have an effective, good faith effort for the tenants in your community there. So if you have questions, obviously feel free to call us, email us. We'd love to continue those. So I'm going to open it up there. As I mentioned, I had some more slides to go through this. We're out of time, but maybe we'll do that another day, or I'll post those online. But now, Kathy, I'll open that up to questions that maybe you've had, and I'll let you kind of manage, which ones to identify, because I don't think I can see them. So
yeah, we have one so far. Is this first step done by committee, officers, or board as a whole when starting the reserve study? Who should start that process? Okay,
yeah. So the first process, really, that should start. It depends. If you have a property manager, it's likely that they've actually addressed that in one of the board meetings. And now each community is different. Some communities don't need reserve studies, in my opinion. If you're an HOA that's mostly homes and you don't maintain anything, I don't know if that's funds well spent. But specifically when we're talking about condominium associations and those types of things, and anybody with amenities, obviously those are recommended. So that may come from the property manager. Otherwise, yes, it would likely, that suggestion should come from a board member. I've had situations where a member in the community brought it up to the board, and the board said, okay, let's explore this more. Really, it should just start with somebody that's knowledgeable about studies and understands the importance of them to communicate that to a board member. So it should really start there. The identifying vendors, you know, if you have a property manager, they can assist with that. If not, you may have to do a little research to identify them. CAI, you know, whether it's reserve studies or any project, has a great directory of providers here in the Heartland chapter. So those are avenues to go to identify them. But the first step should really start with probably a board member or a property manager.
Next question, and who should start the discussion with contractors? Should it be the board? Should it be a committee? What would you suggest as far as that goes?
Yeah, that would be the same thing. So unfortunately, each community is a little bit different. You know, if there's a property manager there, I would recommend have them, you know, trying to reach out to those board members. You know, the first step is going to be identifying a list of potential contractors to work on the project. So I kind of mentioned that here, identifying those by, you know, either going through your property manager, word of mouth, or just kind of reaching out for general information, looking for through directories, those types of things. Once you've identified them at that point, I would recommend most projects, if you have a property manager, to have it go through them. So have them reach out, have them communicate those needs, and obviously have very open conversation with the property manager on where we're at that point. I think sometimes when it goes through a board members, it can get a little diluted if things aren't communicated right, or if you have multiple individuals that are communicating with the potential contractors. But if you have an opportunity to develop a committee, that's a good starting point too. That typically I would recommend is more internal communication around the project. You still want to have a lead on it that does most of the communication for that committee. And then the committee should be meeting on you know, throughout this project and before and during, to kind of discuss all of those lists of things that I went through. That's asking the right questions and defining the scope, those types of things. So it's going to be different for each one, but you do want to have somebody that is a lead on that communication for your community.
Great. We also have just more of a comment from one of our attendees. They just wanted to say thank you. They really appreciate, they learned a lot as they're in the insurance industry, and they said that it really enlightened them and opened up their eyes to what things cost and how they can add up quick. So thank you, they said.
I quickly say I have to say thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss everything that we've kind of gone through today. I appreciate people's attendance. You know, it's a great opportunity for us to kind of help educate on some things too. So I hope that it's been valuable. I know we probably have one more question here, but I just wanted to communicate my appreciation as well.
Yes. Is there a template or approved process for reporting a summary to board?
I'm assuming that's probably referring to reserve studies. There can be a template. Yeah, it's probably something we can develop. I would ask if somebody had a request for maybe a template there, we could provide one. Really, some of the things I went through is the steps of preparing for it, and then recommendations on what should be identified. Typically, when we're reviewing it, we don't have a template, but we're taking the report and we're mostly at the financial deck that's provided with it. And within that deck, there's a lot of good information, but there's a couple pieces in there. It's going to show you your component inventory and then a life cycle on when they're in years on when they're going to be placed. That's typically the foundation of the discussion. So I would recommend using that financial piece, that you have all those components in front of you, what the cost is and when they're going to be replaced, and develop that discussion from there. That should encompass most of that discussion. You will have a little more that goes through the financial recommendations. That's easy to kind of speak to. They're recommending, you know, increasing X amount of dollars or we're good, whatever that may be. But if you would like us to try to maybe put together just a quick bullet point of before, here's what needs to be done, here's what should be talked about, and after, we can do that as well.
The same person just said the question was referring to contractors too. So is there a template or approval process for contractors? And then does the board decide on the contractor?
Yes. So the board is ultimately should be deciding on the contractor, definitely. We use we have templates, but they depend on the project, the scope of the project. So in our case, we may be doing vendor solicitation for a client that is looking for our assistance in identifying vendors, vetting them, and then putting together a summary or a template of each one of those. So we don't have a specific template that is general that's used across each, but we do use those types of templates across projects. So I would recommend developing one on your own if this is a project that you're trying to do on your own, or work with your property manager to develop a template that will summarize those contractors. And then ultimately, as I kind of talked through, have conversations with the contractors. I mean, it's almost like a little bit of an interview. If it's a major project, you want to know who you're working with and who your direct contact is. And then yes, it's up to the board at that point to determine who they want to go with.
Great. Do we have any more questions from the attendees? Okay. Thank you guys. Thanks, everybody for being here today. Thank you to Ross for doing this for us today. We really appreciate your time and your effort putting together this presentation. Our next webinar will be October the 7th, and it's all about protecting your community. So we hope you can make it. Look for the emails to come about that. Again, I would just like to reiterate on what Ross said, that a perfect place to look for those contractors is through the CEI Heartland directory. So we encourage you to do that. Any other questions? Oh, we have somebody else that said thank you for hosting and presenting. So so thanks again, Ross. Thank you to everybody. I hope you guys have a great week. Thanks for being here. For the managers out there, you will get 2 hours of continuing education credit for this webinar. Look for that to come in your inbox. And I think that's all we got for today, Ross, unless you have anything else to add.
No, that's it. I appreciate everybody's attendance and taking time out of your day. I know we're all busy, so I hope it was informative, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Great job.